Welcome back to the program. Every week we like to have a debate on a pressing issue facing our nation. Currently, there's perhaps nothing more significant than immigration. But what impact does it really have on housing, our economy, and our culture? Well, joining me now are two of the best minds in this space, Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist at Macro Business, and pollster Kos Samaras from Redbridge. Leith, let's start with you. What do the numbers actually say about immigration levels in Australia right now?
Yeah, thanks, Freya, and g'day, Kos. Look, I think it's important to look at this through a historical context. So in the first 60 years after World War II, Australia's net overseas migration averaged 90,000 people per year. And in only 2 of those years out of that 60-year period, net overseas migration was more than 150,000. Now, in the 15 years of Big Australia leading up to the pandemic, net overseas migration averaged 220,000 people a year, which was a 145% increase over the post-war average. And in the past 5 years, so up to 2024, which includes the pandemic lockdowns when borders were shut, net overseas migration has averaged 260,000 per year, which is a 190% increase in the post-war average. Now, the latest official net overseas migration numbers, which are for the fourth quarter of last year, showed that last year we had 340,000 net overseas migrants. Now, that's higher than anything the nation had experienced before the pandemic, right? It has come down a bit, but it's higher than anything we'd ever experienced pre-pandemic. And Australia's net permanent long-term arrivals data, which is their monthly release, showed that we've had record net permanent long-term arrivals over the first 6 months of this year, which suggests that net overseas migration might have picked up again. So that's basically what the numbers are telling you. Immigration is very high.
Very fascinating. Kos, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think immigration is too high?
You could probably peg it back a bit, but fundamentally the epicenter of this country's problem when it comes to housing is there's multiple reasons for the problem. Number one, we have a market that's basically been created through Airbnb, where 200,000 plus homes are put on the market since 2016, but are no longer in the rental space. We're not building enough homes, obviously, that's another problem. And at the same time, people can't find the types of homes they want to rent in the suburbs they want to live in. And that is fundamentally the biggest challenge. So it's not necessarily, do migrants impact some of that? To some extent, but ain't the main reason. It's on the sides, it's a contributing factor, but ain't the main reason.
That's really interesting. I've seen some data that shows that apparently here in Australia, we actually have one of the highest rates of new home construction per capita. And really, it's not supply, although we could be better at that, but it's demand. Leith, have you seen any numbers that would support that, or what do you say to Kos's point?
Yeah, so for me, the main issue with the housing market is actually the rental market. So, rather than prices are impacted by interest rates and a whole bunch of stuff. The rental market is really supply versus demand. So it's population demand versus how much you can build, right? And according to Shane Oliver, he's a respected economist, he estimates that Australia's current housing shortage is between 200,000 and 300,000 dwellings. And it's increased, by that amount since we ramped up immigration in the mid-2000s. Now, the federal government's own advisory council, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, forecasts that over the next 5 years, we're going to build 79,000 less homes than the increase in the population, right? So our housing shortage is going to get worse. And those forecasts are based on population projections from the federal budget, which are likely to be conservative. And the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council said that if population growth is 15% higher than projected by Treasury, we're going to have a 200,000 worsening in the housing crisis. However, if we merely cut population growth, well, it's not cut it, but had 15% less population growth than is forecast by the Treasury, we'd actually have a 40,000 surplus in homes over the next 5 years. Now, that tells you in black and white that the number one solution, if you're worried about the rental market and the rental crisis, is to slow down demand by slowing down population growth, which means slowing down immigration.
Kos, what do Australians think about immigration? I've seen some polls that show the majority say they're concerned about it, they think it's too high. But on the other hand, we've seen anti-immigration rallies last weekend, for example, that can be hijacked by extremist elements and perhaps risk alienating people. What do you think the general attitude is out there towards our current immigration levels?
Look, if I read a poll 20 years ago, I'd get the same answers as I'll get now, and that is Australians, any resident of any Western country in the world would tell you they do not like immigration. As human beings, we don't like seeing our society disrupted, and we don't like more competition introduced into the world that we live in. So that's always fundamentally the number one answer we will get, no matter when we ask a survey, is there too much immigration? Now, flip side to that, does it actually persuade the vote? The answer is it does, but on the right side of politics. So what we think is going to happen with the rallies and this issue being elevated is it will start animating the right wing of the coalition's electoral structure. And there's some vulnerability there, because if the coalition is seen as being too soft in that space, what we do know is they lose votes to their right flank. And we've seen that manifest in other contests as well. So it's an interesting situation I think we'll see in the next 2 or 3 years that will unravel for the coalition because of this issue.
How much, I'm keen to get your thoughts on this, Kos, how much of a threat is this to Labor though? Because even at the last election, we saw Labor almost concede to the coalition on immigration. They also said they would cut migration, they would put new caps on international students, etc., etc. So does Labor also see a risk here for them, maybe in their more outer suburban seats?
Not really, you see, because the outer suburban seats that we're looking at that Labor holds and wants to hold at the next election are largely in Melbourne and Sydney, and to a lesser extent Brisbane. And even in Brisbane, some of the seats that they won at the last federal election in that city, one of the contributing factors is the diversity element within these electorates. So the top diverse electorates, that is electorates that have the highest number of Australians who are first or second generation migrants in the country, Labor holds, the coalition only hold 2 of the top 50. And so, you know, Labor's probably sitting there going, well, look, our constituency is diverse, our constituency is pretty clearly defined, and we know who we're going to go into bat for. So they really don't have any much risks. I mean, where we know this issue animates voters in a very strong way, where it does result a shift in the ballot box, it's probably in electorates which the Labor Party don't actually hold at the moment.
Interesting. Leith, if you were a coalition strategist or someone looking to take votes away from Labor, how would you approach this issue of immigration and the conversation around bringing it down to sustainable levels?
Yeah, so look, I always look at this through an economic lens, right? So I personally would like to see Australia's net overseas migration cut to around 120,000 a year, which was basically the early 2000s level before we ramped it up. And I think the coalition should pitch it in that we need quality over quantity, right? So we should be focusing on maximising Australia's productivity, taking stress off housing, infrastructure, those sorts of things. And in order to do that, you need to focus on very highly skilled migrants rather than the sort of quantity-based approach we've got at the moment, where most is actually not very skilled. And it's not actually solving labour shortages because we're not bringing in the right sort of skills to actually solve those shortages. And look, personally, I'd love to see the coalition. They'll never do this, but I'd love to see them actually propose a plebiscite at the next election, not on immigration, but on Australia's future population size. So Australians, I think this should be a democratic process. We should be able to decide how big we want Australia to become. And then once we have those numbers from the plebiscite, policymakers can then calibrate the migration system around achieving that target. Because at the moment, there really is no population plan. It's sort of devised by the Federal Treasury. It just puts in a whole bunch of numbers through the Centre for Population. The federal government, sort of goes for those numbers loosely, but they don't really have any real control over it. And it tends to be viewed about, maximising GDP growth and maximising the federal budget, not per capita living standards, nor livability and those sorts of things, environmental impacts. Those are the sorts of things we need to worry about, and also maximising productivity. We don't do any of that stuff.
Well, that was going to be my next question. We've seen a per capita GDP recession, so living standards have been falling in Australia post-COVID. But I guess our headline economic figures have sort of been propped up by this mass immigration. How much of our immigration policy do you think, Leith, is dictated by lazy governments who would rather import more demand to boost the economy than actually deal with some of the fundamental drivers like slow productivity growth, like low business investment?
Yeah, 100%. So basically, look, the easiest way to grow the economy is just bringing more people, right? You bring in more people, you get more economic activity, you get, higher GDP growth, but it doesn't improve per capita living standards, nor does it improve productivity. One of the reasons why Australia's productivity is so poor, it's not the only reason, it's because we've grown the population so much faster than we've grown business investment, infrastructure, all those sorts of things. And as a result, we've had what economists call capital shallowing. So it's basically where the amount of capital in the economy per worker actually falls, and that makes you less productive. And at the same time, our immigration system is actually very low skilled, despite the fact that it's called skilled. It's actually very low skilled. So what we really need to do is just have a much smaller number, a sustainable number of very high skilled immigration. It should be focused on skills above everything else. Sure, you can have your family visas, but the skilled, we need to focus more on the skilled side of things. Then you'll get higher productivity per person, and you'll also take the pressure off infrastructure, and your business investment will be able to keep up with the population, which will mean you get capital deepening, which actually drives productivity growth.
Fascinating. Well, Kos, just before we go, do you have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, just on the point that we've all been discussing, and that is what the coalition should have done in the 2025 election is, yes, announce a revision of immigration numbers, but focus on promoting the skilled intake, which is largely coming from the diasporas, which are animating the body politic right now. So Indian and Chinese Australians who are very, very much skilled. And when you interview these Australians, they'll tell you, yeah, I've got a university degree, I'm working in health, and so on. So they tick all those boxes, and it's a very safe space for the coalition to be in. I thought they were going to go there in 2025. For some reason, they chose not to.
So fascinating. Well, Leith, Van Onselen and Kos Samaras, that was excellent. Thank you so much for your time.